Hi, everyone. This is Sandy Alt reporting from the wild. And this is the audio podcast companion to my blog on Substack. This is episode 16, Bad Blood. Thanks to the Republican Party, Americans have been taught to hate government, to hate one another, and to hate everyone else, except for billionaires. Republicans began spoon-feeding a curriculum of government starvation and strangulation to Americans as a recipe for success decades ago. Starve the poor and the needy, give no one who isn't already rich a hand up, an ounce of support, or a single opportunity, and throttle and garrote government until it cannot do so either. This was the pitch put forth by Ronald Reagan in his inauguration speech in 1981.
Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
Reagan and his sales force for a Southern strategy, read racism, sought to make Americans believe that tens of thousands of black women, in particular, were getting wealthy on welfare checks and pushing out babies by the gazillions in order to take advantage of the working, read white, families who put in their honest day of work for the dollars they earned. Conservatives began to label some basic survival supplements, such as food stamps and welfare, as entitlements. The idea that a poor woman of color needing to use food stamps so her family could survive made her entitled, as opposed to the fat cats on the Hill in D.C. who cashed in daily on their positions of power, that's absurd. But the average American slurped it up. Reagan was reelected in a landslide, and Republicans promptly expanded their advocacy for shrinking the government. The notion that providing basic benefits for the poor was causing all the problems in the country, and that squeezing off the tap so that government gave nothing to the people while the hardworking citizens paid into it every year, well, that idea was sugar-coated with a finger pointed elsewhere, a finger that pushed people to believe that those others in the country were taking from them. Distracted by this divisive device, too many failed to see how the greed barons at the top of the totem pole were persuading the citizenry to enrich the rich in lieu of providing for the people. The idea that 350 million people don't need to have a government that supports and provides anything at all for its people gained an even bigger platform in 2001 from lobbyist Grover Norquist.
I don't want to abolish government,
He said in an interview with NPR.
I simply want to reduce it to the size where I could drag it into the bathroom and drown it in the bathtub.
Everyone on the R side of the aisle since then has promised a government so small we shouldn't even notice that it's there. Of course, I would argue that there is nothing small about a government that reaches all the way into the uterus of each and every woman and tries to control what goes on there. But these same small government enthusiasts intend, and in some cases have already succeeded, to do that very thing, in spite of the incongruency.
How bad government is.
The crooks in the current administration complain.
How fraudulent.
Claim the frauds.
How wasteful.
Cry the wasters.
How riddled with abuse.
Riddled the abusers. This has been the blood-curdling battle cry of the heartless heads of this abomination administration, who have taken a musk saw to every governmental agency and program that served the people and stood for our former democratic values. Why indeed should we ensure that children have Head Start, or that there are ample air traffic controllers, or that we can respond to citizens in need during disasters, when we can instead work to further enrich our billionaires by ensuring that they never pay their fair share of taxes? Chainsaw engine revs. Wouldn't you rather have more billionaires with more billions than that nasty old national park or that Social Security and Medicare that you paid into with deductions from every paycheck of your working life? Vroom, vroom. Wouldn't you rather we not fight disease, not cure cancer, not fund our schools and universities, not have museums, zoos, and libraries, and instead let a ruling class of rich elites suffocate the government to the point where they have taken it all until we have nothing left for them to take? All this making a show of taking down the government, hacking away at beloved programs, ending agencies, and firing tens of thousands of government workers has finally created some bad blood with folks of every political persuasion. Take it from Taylor Swift. Now we got problems, and I don't think we can solve them. You made a really deep cut. And baby, now we got bad blood. A growing number of Trump voters, even the dumbest, are beginning to realize that by sucking down this swill and casting their votes accordingly, they may perhaps have shot themselves in the foot, or perhaps another more tender part of the anatomy, or even someone or something else that they love. I have a brief but applicable story from the wild about this. Just over a ridge behind the mountain valley where I lived and served as a volunteer firefighter for many years, there was a small state-owned swath of forested land that was called a park. I would use that park term loosely where I consulted, given that it was a small, nearly landlocked parcel only accessible by a mostly unmarked stretch of barely maintained dirt and gravel road. It had no facilities in those days and was marked by a singular bent and rusting sign no bigger than a sheet of letter-sized paper and mounted on a short metal post. Most people missed it, drove on down the road for a few miles until the road dead-ended, consulted the map, and turned back, sometimes missing it again and opting to go elsewhere. Those few who did arrive to recreate were generally there and gone within a couple hours if they didn't turn and leave immediately out of a sense of disappointment, given that there were so many larger and more wondrous open spaces nearby with good trails where one could hike, camp, and take in breathtaking views. Our department would occasionally be called to this area for a search and rescue when a poorly prepared hiker was gone too long, or, more often, for a smoke report from a still smoldering campfire during wildfire season. But on this day, we were called to rescue someone who had been injured. Dispatch did not initially specify the type of injury, but while we were suiting up at the station, we learned that it was a shooting. Now, for those of you not familiar with the rustic life, I would venture to say that there were few, if any, residents of our mountain community who did not own a gun. If you have to scare off a bear trying to break into your bear-proof trash container who won't respond to an air horn or pan clanging, a shot fired into the air will almost always do the trick. If you have tried everything else and cannot get the rabid raccoon that hisses at you from under your front porch to relocate, it's that critter or you, so you know what to do. Occasionally, a mountain lion would attack one of the residents' horses or a hiker's dog on the trails in the surrounding mountains, so protection from an aggressive big cat became a necessity some seasons. Many of my neighbors got an elk tag every autumn and hunted for the meat. Guns are a part of mountain life. Nonetheless, our own familiarity with guns as individuals did not preclude a healthy sense of caution about this fire call. Remote places like this little-used park could become a hideout or a place to stage revenge. People not skilled with guns could start at a sound in the woods and shoot an innocent hiker or camper, mistaking them for menacing wildlife. And there was always the potential for criminal intent. Nefarious types sometimes sought out remote locations for illicit activities or escape from justice. Even up the mountain in the national park, the rangers dealt with the threat of gun violence all too frequently. But the rangers there were armed and trained for this sort of thing. We were not. As volunteers, this was certainly not what we had signed up for. Just the same, no one balked as we piled into the trucks and left the station. An ambulance and a sheriff's deputy had been dispatched from down on the flats, but the ambulance was delayed when the driver missed the turnoff and drove past it for several miles before turning around and heading back. And there had been some confusion over county jurisdiction due to this park being in a patchwork area along county lines and state open space. So the nearest law enforcement was coming from the town up the mountain. Due to our close proximity, we arrived well ahead of either of those units. So, initially, it was just a handful of volunteer firefighters piling out of the trucks with a med kit in the widened turnout area that served as the park entrance. And within minutes, we had ourselves a standoff. I promise I'll come back to this story from the wild before we're done, but right now I'm going to interrupt this tale to return to the developing danger where I began this discourse, which is in the U.S. government. The Trump pestilence administration began its authoritarian takeover with a horde of billionaires assembled prominently to show the strength of the new regime and its plan for their own further enrichment. They began by actively and deliberately hacking away at every part of the government, eliminating agencies, firing employees, and cutting off funding to vital programs. Meanwhile, they showed no shame in conducting countless brazen pageants of supreme corruption, graft so obvious that even the dullest dimwit could not miss it. Billionaires, corrupt totalitarian rulers, criminals, and an assortment of prominent ass-kissers shamelessly paraded back and forth from the private residence of the new American king to the public one, the people's house, the one that we pay for with our taxes, although it could be worked out that we are actually paying for both. Evidently, government should never be so small that we cannot provide whatever opulence the leader requires. And in this case, it's a lot. Gold everywhere in the White House. Millions and millions of dollars for golf outings and stadium appearances. An upcoming multi-million-dollar parade. Pay-to-play access by direct contribution to the leader's Bitcoin Ponzi ploy. And taxpayer-funded trips for him and his entourage to visit his totalitarian bonesaw the journalist to bits co-kings, to collect a lavish new gold-plated jet and openly plot the division of the globe into 3 parts, with certain broods of billionaires ruling over each of these without the consent of the people. With all this spectacle, it is getting harder to hide the ruse, even from the barely awake deplorables who put this clot of tyrannical thieves in power. The Republican Congress has mutated into an army of zombie-like orcs, frothing at the mouth while hacking away at our basic social safety nets in the U.S. House and Senate. Their frenzied kill fests do not escape notice, even though they try to use the dark of night to cloak their murderous movements, driving spears into the hearts of the programs they swore to protect, then giving the meat and blood to their dark satanic billionaire lords to fatten them in their already engorged coffers. The stains on the Republican souls bleed through onto their shirts and their suits in daylight, exposing their craven contempt for their constituents and their licentious lust for riches and power. Theirs is an addict's junkie quest. Imagine the bartender asking the drunk, or the dealer asking the junkie,
Will you sell out your country to be part of the new billionaire empire?
As the greed tender holds out a tantalizing taste of being unbelievably rich.
Yes, yes, oh yes.
The Republican members of Congress reach for a fix as they hand the government to the wake of liars and thieves and surrender their own power to them. The greed tender holds out another shot of evil ecstasy.
Will you sell out the oath you took, abandon all your duties, forfeit the ability to look anyone in the eye without shame and self-disgust, destroy the future of your children and grandchildren?
Yes, yes, oh yes.
They slobber as they slither past the press, spewing lies to them and to their constituents, or with luck, they avoid their electorate altogether, hoping no one will notice their mercenary measures and moldering corpse breath as their souls wither within them. Today, we have a hybrid of Reagan and Norquist on ketamine and ecstasy, and an army of Sauron running the government. Their entourage of deceiver pimps pump out a never-ending bilge of crap designed to disinform and poison the public. They are exceptionally good at this miasma technique because they built this syndicate on bad blood. Through a fog of fantastical fabrications called a campaign, the evil overlords urged voters to hate every human being who spoke another language, came here from another country, who didn't have white skin, and or who wasn't a crazed Christo-fascist. Except for a few notable exceptions, like Putin's puppet handler Melania, and for some unknown reason, Kash Patel. The neo-Nazi Dark Lords infused their addle-brained followers with a hatred of their fellow Americans who don't wear red hats or who voted Democrat or, God forbid, practiced critical thinking. They continue to flood the airwaves, the headlines, the onlines, and the outlines with venom and vituperation, such as the White House press barfings and the perfidious performances in the Oval Office by the backside ring-smooching soldiers of evil they call a cabinet. I think we got here, at least in part, because for decades, a band of parsimony proponents have taught the American people that their government is not only wasteful, fraudulent, and full of abuse, but that it is unnecessary. And the problems, real or invented, were always because of those others. The name of the disease that demands mindless followers to march like an army in hate-paced lockstep is evil. Their motive for destroying the democracy is greed, plain and simple. As to those mindless followers, let me quickly conclude the story from the wild that I began earlier. As I said, there was a standoff when we arrived. A man met the crew on the trail, an automatic rifle slung over his shoulder on a strap. Our assistant chief was in command, and he told the other firefighters to stay back while he went to talk to the man and assess scene safety. The two went up the trail and disappeared over the rim. There was a wounded man on the ground in the camp where the incident had occurred. The victim had sustained a gunshot wound to his derriere, and someone had applied a compress that was saturated with blood. There were more blood-soaked bandages nearby. A third civilian had left the scene before we arrived, presumably to get someplace where there was enough cell phone connectivity to make the 911 call. But after doing so, he had not returned. The two men remaining in the park had contrived an unbelievable story about how the victim had sustained the injury, claiming he had somehow shot himself in the ass. Chief was not buying it and pressed for details. His initial assessment was that the injured man had likely suffered a serious wound, but not a life-threatening one, and he wanted to make sure the situation was safe before he put any of us on the crew at risk. The concoction of fabrications the two had constructed began to unravel with each question. They, a father and son, and at least one other person, had been target shooting in the woods. One of them, and possibly more than one, had priors with law enforcement, hence the contrived story designed to protect the real shooter. They wanted us to call off the sheriff before they consented to letting the firefighters treat the victim, who was in considerable pain. Our chief refused. This became a heated conversation, and although they were out of line of sight, we could hear their raised voices, and two of our firefighters were already up at the top of the trail watching what was happening in case our chief needed assistance. At one point, Chief threatened to leave the victim there and let law enforcement handle it once they got there, rather than put our firefighters at risk to begin treating the wounded man. Finally, the civilian still standing relented. He agreed to disarm and remove all the rifles from the scene so our EMT and the other firefighters could bring in the sled and begin triage. We had advised dispatch on the radio as the scene had escalated, and 2 deputies and a highway patrolman arrived just as our team was loading the wounded man onto a sled. This could have ended differently if it had not been handled so bravely and superbly by our chief and our crew and our mutual aid partners. In the end, no pun intended, the 2 men had to let go of their lies and admit that they needed our help, and they had to face accountability for what had transpired. We are not likely to see this kind of surrender and accountability from the most deeply indoctrinated maggots. But if the wounds are painful enough to the country, they, too, will bleed, and this may force a stand down. When more folks find themselves bleeding from the hits to their health care, their Medicaid, their Social Security, their SNAP benefits, their kids' and grandkids' government-sponsored programs, then those less fervent in their fury against their fellow citizens and less addicted to the lies they've been fed about the evil of government might relent and change sides. As they see the gold-tinged glare of greed growing like a pathogen in the White House and the despicable deeds of the richest man in the world, it seems more and more people who voted for this, or who simply didn't vote at all, are already beginning to surrender their stockpile of false beliefs and their foolish faith in their former leader. Some are already starting to sidle up to the community rally against the deportation of their immigrant neighbor who took care of their lawn or waited tables at the cafe. Some are seeing the Trump tyranny move to create a police state in Los Angeles and are witnessing the horror of the National Guard and the threat of the military to control the masses and overpower the state's rights to control how peaceful protests are managed. Some have even joined the demonstrations against the evil empire under which they are now beginning to suffer. And as more of that happens, maybe now we have a chance to turn this bad blood between us into getting into some good trouble together. This has been Sandy Alt reporting from the wild. Every week or so, I publish a written blog on Substack, and then a few days after, I produce a variation of the blog as a podcast like this one with original music, sound effects, and more. You can read and subscribe to the companion blog to this podcast on Substack at sandyalt.substack.com. I hope you'll subscribe and share it with your friends. I want to thank the great Michael Clarkson and T. Kearns from my production team for their fantastic voiceovers as Greed Tender and the Republican Junkies. Also from the team, Deb and Ron Shukar and Stephanie and Tim Currington provided the money chorus. And I have quoted a few lines from the song Bad Blood, written by the brilliant Taylor Swift and Kendrick Lamar. It's a great piece of music to help you work out some of your anger, whether it's on the dance floor or tapping your toes while you crank up the volume on the protest line. Look for it wherever you get your music. And if you want more stories from the wild, look for my Wild Mystery Series in book, audiobook, and ebook. You can start with any book in the series and go wild. Running for cover, when are we gonna learn? The 35's just 25. It's
turn.